Thanks very much for the opportunity to speak regarding what's changing in vaccine safety. I apologise for not being there in person. I'd first of all like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which I normally work and live, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And as you've heard far more eloquently and in much more detail earlier in this meeting, we live in unusual times. And I'm speaking to you from Samoa, where the gentleman on the left there, RFK Jr., managed to contribute to the measles outbreak in Samoa, where I'm currently, when he was an unauthorised guest in the vacant US ambassador's residence at the start of the measles outbreak in Samoa back in 2018, where 83 people, predominantly children under the age of 5, lost their lives. And he managed to sow further doubt regarding the safety of measles vaccine after an immunisation error had contributed to the deaths of 2 children earlier. And the policies of the current US administration seem unusual to say the least, and are threatening not only the safety of US children and adults, but also the ongoing misinformation ripples from this effect globally. Bob Chen, a number of decades ago now, developed the concept of the vaccine safety life cycle, where at the start of when a vaccine is introduced, the cases of disease are high and the awareness of the community and healthcare providers in disease is high. And as vaccination in the blue line gradually rises, you get a reduction in disease, and you also get a corresponding increase in vaccine reactions. And often at some point, if you look at number 5 on that list, you may get a point where confidence in the vaccine, because of concern around adverse events, drops. And that may be what we're seeing, certainly in the US, where you then get a corresponding rise in disease. Now, if all things go well, hopefully the community and providers become far more conscious of the risks of disease again, and vaccine uptake goes on. And we can only hope that's what may occur in the US at the moment. And typically, if the program's re-established, we can get disease down again, and in the perfect world, eradicate measles, noting that the WHO's target for measles eradication was the year 2000. What we also know is that all validated models of vaccine hesitancy incorporate vaccine safety or vaccine benefit risk as a major driver for vaccine hesitancy. And vaccine safety, we get most of our information before vaccines are introduced, obviously, from well-conducted clinical trials, including phase 3 clinical trials that typically involve either thousands or tens of thousands of participants. Whereas post-licensure surveillance, we're reliant on real-world evidence. And that real-world evidence comes from a variety of sources. Typically, it occurs from spontaneous surveillance, where we know that though reported adverse events, it does quite a good job for immediate short-term adverse events and severe adverse events where people are more likely to report them as adverse events following vaccination. However, we know the majority of adverse events are underreported, in particular those that might be delayed or that are milder, that don't reach hospital, or where the healthcare practitioner doesn't believe that vaccinations are the cause. In particular, there's underreporting in those with poor access to healthcare, in particular older Australians and residents of aged care facilities. And then some of the other barriers are that just the amount of paperwork and time involved in reporting, as well as in some settings, lead to financial penalties. So, for example, we know during the COVID pandemic that reporting from emergency departments almost disappeared, not because they weren't interested in vaccine safety, but because they were absolutely flat out caring for patients. So what we find for post-licensure surveillance, that's where there's ongoing safety monitoring. That's where for the first time you detect rare events. We get to see how the vaccine works in different populations compared to the clinical trials, noting that clinical trials have strict inclusion and exclusion criteria, which is not the case when a vaccine is introduced into a community. It's also the first time we see the vaccine being used in different schedules to the clinical trials, in real life use, which may include vaccine errors, and it's where we may pick up batch issues in terms of safety problems. So, for example, a very well-conducted large phase 3 clinical trial, such as the Pfizer vaccine, which had 22,000 subjects per arm, what they did not study was the vaccine used in combination with other vaccines, its use in pregnant women or lactating mothers, those with underlying healthcare conditions, in children, in the frail elderly who may have multiple comorbidities, or when used in differing schedules. We only found those out after the vaccine had been introduced. Maurice Hilleman, who introduced many of the routine vaccines in our vaccine schedules through his development work at Merck, was often quoted as saying, "I never breathe a sigh of relief until the first 3 million doses have been delivered." Because at that point, you can begin to be confident that there aren't any rare side effects that may not have been picked up during the earlier parts of development. So the mainstay of vaccine surveillance has always been spontaneous surveillance, with reporting by either healthcare workers or the community. And as mentioned, it always underreports. In Victoria, that system is SAFIC, and all jurisdictions report onward to the TGA for the Australian government. And it's spontaneous surveillance is the primary source of signal detection for vaccine safety signals. But it also, unfortunately, only gives numerator data only, which means it's hard for us to know what the rate of those adverse events are and how that may compare with the normal background rate of those events if there was no vaccine. Active surveillance, on the other hand, is where you go actively looking for cases of adverse events. And that forms a variety of major types, if you like. There's solicited surveillance used by AUSVAC Safety in Australia, where you receive an SMS or an email, or in some developing settings, you may actually have a healthcare worker visiting the village to ask around adverse events. There's sentinel systems, which we use in Australia as part of the PED surveillance network in major paediatric hospitals, typically for the severe adverse events. Then there's syndromic surveillance, which we use here's an example here for what we use in general practice to look for crude all-cause representations within 1 week of vaccination. And then there's large linked databases, best known for the US's Vaccine Safety Data Link, but we also have a statewide linked data system called the Vaccine Safety Health Link, or VISHL, in Victoria. And what this means is that we can now get large amounts of data from all levels of the healthcare system. As you can imagine, the more severe your adverse event is, the more likely you are to present to hospitals where we've had our traditional surveillance systems. But there are still important adverse events that may not present to hospital and are still important and may have an impact on confidence in the vaccine programs that may only present to general practice or may just predominantly occur in the community. And so we've built electronic data systems that can monitor at all levels of this. And different systems have different ability in terms of the populations they cover, how good they are for picking up reactogenicity, in other words, local and systemic adverse events that occur shortly after vaccination are typically relatively common, how good they are at picking up safety signals overall, how much they cost. And so largely multiple systems are ideal for covering most safety concerns. That's not only the case for whether you can detect a signal and then may say we might have a problem, let's go looking, as well as hypothesis testing, so both validating and investigating those signals, where the best systems typically are obviously clinical trial data. The solicited surveillance, or AUSVAC safety, is sometimes useful for their very short-term, relatively common adverse events, but otherwise we're left with the sentinel surveillance and what's primarily used nowadays, the large linked data sets. So how does that mean we're ensuring safety now? What we've taken, at least in Victoria, is the existing systems of reported adverse events, so the spontaneous surveillance, together with the AUSVAC safety surveys and the sentinel surveillance. And what we've added is linked data sets in the Vaccine Safety Health Link. We've got real-time GP data that's not linked, but provides a link between vaccines given in general practice and the subsequent health outcomes presenting back within general practice, as well as online media surveillance using AI, in particular monitoring social media systems, which often picks up new concerns that we hadn't heard about previously that we can then investigate looking at those other systems. And that means now we're pretty much covering all parts of the healthcare system, irrespective of where people might present. One example of this integrated system is that just before Christmas, we had a potential safety signal pop up in both spontaneous surveillance and subsequently in our emergency department part of our linked data set, where it appeared that children after Prevnar 20 had a higher rate of adverse events than what we'd previously seen with Prevnar 13. So as part of that, what we did was we looked, first of all, at how many doses were being administered and what the likelihood was of how much that might be a problem. We looked at the published literature, and high-quality head-to-head trials had been conducted in the US using the US schedule, which showed no increase in adverse events in Prevnar 20 compared to Prevnar 13. As I said, we also looked in our Vaccine Safety Health Link, and what it showed was that there did appear to be a higher rate of presentation to the emergency department within 7 days, 14 days and 21 days of Prevnar in the 2-month age group, a lesser so in the 4-month age group, and no signal at all in the 12-month age group. However, there was no specific syndrome that was being presented with, and in particular, there did not appear to be an increase in severity in triage categories for those children that were presenting. So we then went and looked in an independent data set, the general practice data set, using that Farrington algorithm I showed earlier. And what it showed was that there was absolutely no signal in terms of vaccines, in terms of representation in very large primary care data sets. That gave us the reassurance to wait another month for a data refresh on our Vaccine Safety Health Link. And the signal that we'd previously seen in the emergency department data had washed away with increased numbers and increased confidence, which meant that we were able to not raise a false alarm around a vaccine safety signal for Prevnar 20. As we just heard from Julia, the power of combining data sets for rare events means that we can now answer questions that previously couldn't be answered. And an example of this is the Global Vaccine Data Net, for which both Victoria and New South Wales are taking part as collaborators. And what that means is that we can get health data from diverse populations around the world, linking immunisations to health outcomes. It means we can compare different vaccines and schedules. And it means we've finally got the statistical power to rule in or rule out associations with rare events. That's resulted during the COVID era with the world's largest vaccine safety study. And we're now surveying sites from 6 continents, 35 countries, 37 different sites, with partners in Europe and Africa, and a population of over 600 million people, which gives us the power to potentially answer really important questions about rare conditions with confidence. So the major lessons we learned during COVID were that with the pandemic, a massive vaccine response into the community, that there's a massive increase in adverse event reports, and we need to automate anything we can using business intelligence, natural language processing, and AI simply to cope with the flood of reports. We were lucky in that the post-licensure reactogenicity in all of the studies, including OSVAC safety, were very similar to those observed in the trials. The critical importance of engaging specialist communities who often see unusual adverse events before our surveillance systems was underlined, as well as having clear case definitions for potential adverse events. What we found is that they were important, but they were clunky, and especially in terms of trying to validate them from real-world data. And during peacetime between pandemics is an ideal time to try and validate those using real-world data much more efficiently. Whenever you massively swell the immunising workforce, the vaccine error potential goes up, and we certainly saw that during COVID. And with the introduction of new pandemic vaccines with CEPI's 100-day mission, the only way we can rapidly answer questions after vaccines are introduced after only 100 days of development is using real-world data, preferably from multiple sources. And so finally, what lessons have we learned post-COVID? We've learned that different health system level data helps us detect different adverse events, but different health systems can detect or miss different adverse events, and so we need it from all of them. Australia, and in particular Victoria, have very disparate data systems for both hospital and other data, and the increasing use of common data models means that we can potentially combine data from these disparate sources and inform on common outcomes. There's a strong interplay between vaccine confidence and safety communication, and we need to get better at vaccine benefit risk communication. For the first time ever during COVID, we saw false reports of death, deliberately false reports of death to surveillance systems, and we need to understand how to deal with those rapidly. As we've seen already, the unthinkable can happen. And then finally, although AI has many threatening roles, there has been a beneficial role of AI in pharmacovigilance and vaccine benefit risk. So with that, I'd just like to thank all of these wonderful people who've contributed so much to Victoria's and Australia's vaccine safety surveillance. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim. We've probably got time for one question before we have to wrap things up, if anybody has a question. No? You've provided them with lots of information. Thanks, Jim. And at this stage, we have no online questions. And so thank you very much for your talk. You obviously informed them so well that they've got all the details they need.
I've just got one online question if you want me to answer that.
No, You want to ask a question? No, we haven't got a question. No one's asked a question.
No, there is. No, I've received one online question.
Oh, right. Okay. I'm sorry I don't have it, so.
No dramas. So although the national databases collect numerator data, typically what we do is we estimate the background rates. Now, ideally what we do that is in linked data sets so that we have the denominator, we know how many people have been vaccinated. Otherwise, what we do is look over a longer period of time to see is there consistency around the adverse event rates within our community. But essentially, whenever you use the word rate, you need a denominator. So with numerator data only, you can use other systems, which is largely disproportionality analyses, which the jurisdictional services and the TGA use as well to see, are you seeing a higher proportion of reports being this particular adverse event? And so there are systems that work without a denominator. They are useful, but having denominator data really improves things, hence the linked data sets. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Jim. And Rod will close the meeting for us.